Along much of North America's west coast, there came a time when one increasingly encountered the same scene beneath the water. A lifeless seabed, home to maybe a couple of fish and hundreds of sea urchins, and the most striking part, these underwater stretches used to be full-on forests made of seaweed. Then it all turned into a sterile wasteland. And that's not even mentioning how seaweed, especially when it grows in thick clusters, isn't just more beautiful than bare rocks, but also an amazingly useful environment for all sorts of creatures. There could be hundreds or thousands of fish and vertebrates and other ocean dwellers living there, because for them, underwater plants mean both food and a place to hide. So how do we get all that sea life back? One idea is to release a few hundred sea otters. Now let's see how that works. Mustelidae have been around on our planet for a long time, including in North America. As scientists have figured out, about 5 million years ago, there were members of the marten family roaming the earth who turned out to be ancestors of several modern freshwater otters. However, some members of this family, it seems, decided that living in freshwater wasn't really their thing. It's way better to head off into saltwater and settle down there. Over time, a whole species came to be, settling along the coast from northern Japan all the way down to southern California and Mexico. And then, no, it wasn't colonizers who showed up and started wiping out the cute little creatures living in the shallow waters. Scientists came to the conclusion that sea otters faced a lot of issues like diseases, which repeatedly cut down their population. As a result, according to some data, the number of individuals by 1741 was only about 150 to 300,000. They calmly swam around, managing to survive along the northern, eastern, and western edges of the Pacific Ocean, handling the conditions around them thanks to a unique trait. But this isn't about fat, like lots of other animals have in cold places. Sea otters just don't have that thick layer. The main thing that helps sea otters handle cold water is the thickest fur among any animal. Someone once counted and found that over 150,000 hairs grow on just 0.2 square inches of the animal's body. And of course, people couldn't ignore such valuable fur. That's how the so-called Great Hunt began. And in North America, pretty much everyone who'd come over from Europe got involved. As a result, since 1741, the number of sea otters across their entire range has dropped from 150 to 300,000 to just 1 to 2,000. Back then, if a species had any value, it was pretty much doomed. And that's exactly what happened to sea otters. Here's another way to show the scale of the sea otter slaughter and the population crash that followed. It's the sales of pelts on the London fur market. In the 1880s, the supply started dropping sharply. People had simply reached the point where otters were already hard to find. Let's move on to Alaska and the Aleutian Islands. One of the largest habitats of sea otters used to be there. After a significant decline in their numbers due to the Great Hunt, which we talked about earlier, a nature reserve was created on Amchitka Island in the 1930s, where the sea otter population grew so much that it exceeded the amount of hunting yield. However, someone threw even more tests at the local otters, nuclear tests. In the mid-60s, Amchitka Island was used to test nuclear weapons. Cold War and all that? Needless to say, because of that, the number of sea otters dropped significantly. Various sources claim that in the 1980s, about 55,000 to 100,000 sea otters settled on the Aleutian Islands. Sounds great, especially after humanity reduced the total number of individuals to just a couple of thousand due to hunting. There were several population declines both in Alaska and on the islands, but according to researchers, the situation is stabilized. Various legal restrictions helped, including the international ban on otter hunting from 1911 and the species being listed as endangered under the Endangered Species Act. As a result, new research in the 21st century has shown that there are between 20,000 and 50,000 sea otters in Alaska and the Aleutian Islands, depending on the area. At the same time, scientists say that the overall population trend is stabilized, so things aren't that bad. But sea otters used to live in many areas across North America. And you know, this situation was much worse back then. By 1929, sea otters had been completely wiped out off the coast of British Columbia. Researchers carried out studies and came to the conclusion that in regions where mammals with unique fur were completely eradicated, barren areas began to form underwater, looking like deserts. There's practically no life there. No fish in abundance, no seaweed, no other local inhabitants. Only sea urchins, which made the seafloor seem almost alien. There were a huge number of them. Obviously, this wasn't something anyone was happy about. So in 1969, Canadian biologists made the decision to reintroduce the creatures that had once thrived in the area before becoming the target of fur hunting, sea otters. The only question was where to get these marine mammals from. Very strangely, but in this situation, it was helped by U.S. nuclear energy. In the 1960s, the U.S. Atomic Energy Agency planned to carry out underground nuclear tests in the Bering Sea on the very same island of Amchitka. Because of this, the Canadians were given permission to take some sea otters that still lived in that area and move them to the Vancouver Island region. On July 31st, 1969, 29 otters were caught and brought to the Checoset Bay. Unfortunately, there was a problem. Not many of the animals made it through the move. Then, in 1970, a second attempt was made. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service staff caught 45 sea otters, put them on board a ship, and then transported them to the bay. Once again, the relocation couldn't be called a success. Only 19 animals made it to the destination. But in 1975, they made another attempt, after which the phrase, "the transplant was a thorough success," was said. This time, they added a shot of anti-stress hormone for each of the 46 animals sent. They all made it. At that point alone, the project could already be called a success, because even a few dozen creatures can make a difference on the wastelands where thousands of sea urchins had spread out. The thing is, sea urchins are, let's say, a real treat for sea otters. And when there are no sea otters around, these guys get perfect conditions to breed uncontrollably. At the same time, the favorite food of sea urchins is algae. Lots of sea urchins means algae disappearing at an insane rate, which can eventually wipe out entire underwater forests made up, for example, of kelp thickets. Kelp forests, meanwhile, serve as a home for a massive variety of organisms, from fish to the tiniest creatures, and they also perform a ton of useful functions for the oceans and seas. They're one of the most productive and fast-changing ecosystems in the world. Although seaweed forests, together with coral reefs, make up only 0.1% of the Earth's surface, they contribute 0.9% to global primary production. So the initial extermination of sea otters led to sea urchins breeding like crazy, gobbling up tons of kelp and wiping out the ocean floor, causing massive damage to the whole ecosystem. There's a reason sea otters are called a keystone species. They're a crucial part of keeping coastal waters healthy, even though their numbers are small. Even a small group of sea otters that showed up near Vancouver Island caused the ecosystem to start bouncing back to its normal state. Alright, even a single otter would have done a pretty good job with a small area overrun by sea urchins, simply because every cute little mammal that floats around on its back in a funny way is actually a total glutton. Just imagine, the average weight of an adult otter is 55 pounds, and it eats 20 to 30% of that every day. And here we've got several dozen sea otters. By the way, these dozens quickly turned into thousands. As of 2004, Vancouver's population had already grown to over 3,000 individuals. And by 2013, more than 5,600 sea otters were swimming in the waters around the island. Clearly, that many marine mammals are doing a good job keeping in check the large areas that were once wiped out by people chasing profits from valuable fur. All in all, the relocation project can definitely be called a success. Some kind of population has been brought back. And on top of that, in April 2007, the Committee on the Status of Endangered Wildlife in Canada changed its assessment of the sea otter from threatened to special concern. It's worth noting that biologists, ecologists, and others working to bring back the otters are pretty concerned too, because of oil. Black gold is a threat to every species living in the seas, oceans, and really anywhere, because just one major spill is enough to wipe out entire populations. However, sea otters have a particularly tense relationship with oil. Look, the most important thing that helps sea otters survive in the harsh Pacific Ocean is their incredibly dense fur. Even a slight change in its condition can be fatal. So oil is something that can seriously damage the state of their fur coat. When their fur gets soaked in oil, it stops holding air, loses its insulating properties, and that's what makes otters unable to handle the cold of the water they live in. On top of that, they start losing their ability to swim. And when oil gets on their fur, otters start cleaning it, which causes the oil to get into their bodies. Basically, you get the idea. Oil is a total enemy of the species, and all scientists say this in unison, ignoring even the fact that humans once nearly wiped out the global otter population. And not too far from Vancouver Island, there was already an oil spill that had sad consequences for sea otters. In March 1989, the Exxon Valdez oil spill happened in Prince William Sound. Back then, a giant oil tanker hit Bligh Reef, spilling over 37,000 tons of crude oil into the water, making it the second biggest disaster in the U.S. after the 2010 Deepwater Horizon incident. One of the species that really suffered from the spill was sea otters. More than 1,000 oil-soaked sea otter carcasses were pulled from the water, and the actual death toll, according to different estimates, is several times higher. In addition, oil became not just the reason for the decline of the Alaskan population here and now, but also a long-term problem. In the 2006 Exxon Valdez oil spill oversight report, otters were officially named one of the species still suffering from residual oil in the disaster area. Yes, 17 years after all the events. Can sea otters simply escape the spill, move somewhere else, and settle there? Otters don't even try to swim long distances because they don't risk going into deep water. They can't dive there and get food. For this reason, their habitats are very limited, so even a small-scale oil spill can completely wipe out a population that has no way to escape. Besides oil, there's also concern for the recovering population due to their neighbors in the seas. After counting the population in 2000, it turned out that their number decreased from about 55 to 100,000 individuals to 6,000. Right away, it was concluded that the cause of the population decline wasn't hunger or disease, but orcas. It sounds like a normal thing in nature, but people also played their part here. Look, orcas usually hunt seals, sea lions, and whales whose populations have seriously declined, of course due to hunting. They have to eat something, so orcas turned their attention to sea otters. This theory has never been confirmed. It's controversial, but that doesn't mean humans haven't once again been the reason for the decline in sea otter numbers. Of course, the real concern is, naturally, people, not because of large-scale hunting, which is banned, but simply because they might be poaching and killing sea otters fairly discreetly. Yes, despite all the bans and the high level of species protection from the government. First of all, people kill because the fur of these animals is still as valuable as it was back in the days of the Great Hunt. And secondly, well, this part needs a bit more explanation. Otters dive for their food underwater and take not only sea urchins, but everything else they can eat, including sea cucumbers, crabs, and mussels. When there are no otters, for example, mussels, just like urchins, grow in number because their main predator's gone. When otters are around, the number of mollusks decreases. Mussels, in the meantime, are a valuable resource, so their reduction for residents of certain areas is a real problem. This is exactly what happened with Checoset Bay, where indigenous people have lived along the shore for a long time. No one even informed them that at some point a group of otters brought from Alaska would be placed in the local waters, so people didn't have time to prepare in any way. In the end, one of the locals says, if they'd told us what otters would do to our seafood, we would have fought them. So even if there had been a notice, no one would have liked the idea of restoring the mammal population. Overall, otter restoration is a very complex task. But in British Columbia, and specifically around Vancouver Island, they're managing it quite successfully. There are plenty of risks, but so far everything's going as it should. Are there any other places where they're bringing otters back? Let's remember the otter's habitat range. It used to stretch along the western coast of North America all the way down to Southern California, and it's in California where they're actively fighting for the survival of these animals. In 1920, it was believed that the southern subspecies of sea otters, which lived off the coast of California, had been completely wiped out due to extensive hunting. However, in 1938, a group of about 50 otters was found off the Big Sur coast. That's why no new otters were brought here. Everyone focused on saving those animals that had somehow managed to hide from the ever-present hunters. For example, the federal government added southern sea otters to the endangered species list, which played a big role in restoring their population. The creation of the Monterey Marine Protected Area also played a big role. The Monterey Bay Aquarium Sea Otter Program started monitoring southern sea otters in 1984. Since 1988, the aquarium has been actively involved in raising otter pups that were washed up on the shore. They were fed, you could say raised, and then released back into the wild, thus increasing the local population. The otters raised by humans got used to the water, learned how to swim, find food, and in the end, from 1985 to 2001, nearly 100 rehabilitated otters were released. That's population recovery for you. However, there were problems. For instance, no one taught the pups that humans are creatures that should be approached with caution. Moreover, most of the pups still couldn't reintegrate into the wild, which meant they had to be caught and constantly cared for in captivity. They decided to change their approach in the aquarium. They brought in several female southern otters and then started letting them raise the orphaned pups. This led to the otter pups being wary of humans, and their survival rate became comparable to that of their wild relatives. From 2002 to 2015, researchers collected data on more than 30 otters raised by females in captivity and concluded a year after their release, over 70% survived, which is twice as many as those raised by humans. Another study of the aquarium was conducted together with experts from the University of California, Santa Cruz, which showed the following. From 2002 to 2016, otters raised through the new approach, along with their pups, made up 55% of the population growth in Elkhorn Slough. The increase in the number of otters led to improvements in the local habitat by reducing the number of sea urchins that eat algae. Well, you already know about this. Everything happened the same way here. In the end, humanity came to its senses just in time and started working on restoring the populations of such a useful animal for our planet. One could say that sea otters didn't occupy that large a part of the ocean, but in nature, everything is interconnected, so their complete disappearance could have led to irreversible consequences.